Welcome to the second session of our three-part series, Jews and Islam, exploring shared histories. Today we continue our exciting journey into the intricate and multifaceted relationship between these two influential communities. Building on our previous session, we will delve deeper into moments of collaboration and periods of tension, further illuminating the interconnected paths that have defined their shared history and continue to shape our present global landscape.
He is well. He is well known there. He's has a reputation as being a faithful believer, but also he had played a role while in Mecca as being an arbiter of tribal disputes in Medina. He was seen as a sort of a neutral figure, and he was very much seen as a trusted arbiter. So his very positive reputation had preceded him by the time he arrived in the city of Medina with this small group of followers. Now, let us now move to the stage of the story where Muhammad is in Medina. Let's remember that up until this point, the city of Medina has been called Yathrib. It's only called Medina once Muhammad establishes his presence in the city. Medina basically is an Arabic word which means something like a city or even a state. It's in fact very closely related to the Hebrew Medina, which also means a state as well. So what happens is that once Muhammad settles in the city and he has a chance to settle down, at his insistence, the pagan community of Medina, together with the Muslim and the Jewish clans, sign a pact of mutual protection and obligation. This is referred to in Islamic history as the Constitution or the Treaty of Medina itself. Now, I've got a quote here from a work by Peters, which, by the way, I should just mention for those of you interested, Peters' work is a 3-volume work which has an amazing collection of primary sources and commentaries that compare Judaism, Christianity, and Islam across a whole range of themes. It's an excellent collection. So Peters makes this point. He says, included in Ibn Itzhak's Life of the Prophet is a document that purports to record the political arrangements that were contracted between Muhammad and his partisans. They were actually referred to as muhajirun. Anyone who had converted to Islam were known as muhajirun, and citizens of Medina. So the contracting parties agreed to recognize Muhammad as their leader and to accept his judgments. And in so doing, they were acknowledging, as was the Prophet himself, that they were in fact one community, or the Arabic word is an ummah, not a community that was yet uniquely composed of Muslims, that would come later, but committed nevertheless to defend its joint interests, or what was now defined to be the common good. Because we have to appreciate that at this point in the story, the community of Muhammad's followers, and both he as well, are under threat from the Quraysh. Even though he has fled the city of Mecca, the Quraysh saw in him a potential threat even to their own continuing power, and therefore they sought to pursue him as well. And therefore, by extension, if Muhammad and his followers in the city of Medina were going to be under threat from the Quraysh, it meant that the whole city was under threat as well. And that's why it was in their collective interests to sign this particular pact of mutual self-protection and committing themselves, as Peter says, to the common good. So what then happens is that a word before I go on about Ibn Itzhak, because I've referred here to the fact that this particular constitutional treaty is referred to in Ibn Itzhak's work, because the treaty itself is not referred to in the Quran. It crops up in what is known as the Hadith. I think I mentioned this term last week. The Hadith are the collected oral sayings, if you want, the oral traditions about Muhammad that started to be collected after his death. So these are sayings and traditions attributed to the Prophet known as the Hadith. Now, Ibn Itzhak was one of the very earliest collectors of these particular traditions. His work is dated to about the 8th century, and he actually put together a work called The Life of the Prophet, The Life of Muhammad, which is about as close as you're going to get to a very early biographical work of the Prophet. So this is who Ibn Ishaq was. Um, and as far as the constitution of Medina itself is concerned, you actually have a copy of that, or I've sent you a copy of that in your notes. I'm not going to necessarily read through the whole thing, but as you can see, it's essentially a document which focuses very, very much on the obligations of each of the different elements of the community in Medina. And the selections that I have focused on in the material that I sent you in the notes very, very much focuses on the obligations of the Jewish community of Medina. And basically, in essence, they were guaranteed protection and safety from outside invaders and from the enemies of the community, but they also had to commit to defend the community in the event of the community coming under attack. I mean, as it says here in the notes in the last paragraph, the Jews must bear their expenses and the Muslims their expenses. Each must help the other against anyone who attacks the people of this document. They must seek mutual advice and consultation, and loyalty is a protection against treachery. A man is not liable for any of his allies' misdeeds. The wrong must be helped. The Jews must pay tribute to the believers as long as the war lasts. Yathrib shall be, that is, Medina shall be a sanctuary for the people of this document. And if any dispute or controversy should arise, it must be referred to God and to Muhammad as the messenger of God. So keep that in mind. This is a very, very important element of the story, and it's going to have a very significant impact on the relationship between Muhammad and the Jewish community of Medina. Now, what happens also at about this time is that the direction of Muslim prayer changed from Jerusalem. Up until that time, Muslims had been facing Jerusalem during their time of prayer. Remember, Muslims pray 5 times a day, and now the direction of prayer was changed to Mecca. And this certainly did mark an important point of departure in Muslim-Jewish relations. And different commentators, different scholars interpret this in a variety of ways. Some interpret this as the beginning of a breakdown in Muslim-Jewish relations, because one of the things that certainly happened is that even though Muhammad had hoped that the Jewish community of Medina would accept him as the last and final prophet to whom a revelation had been made, this had not been the case. Because you've got to remember, as far as Jews were concerned, the last prophets were the ones who appeared in the Bible. And with the close of the biblical period, according to Jewish tradition, God no longer communicated his will to any prophets, which is one of the reasons, by the way, why the Jews also rejected Jesus as a prophet of God. For them, the last prophet began with the last prophet ended with the end of the period of the Old Testament. But nevertheless, so some interpret this as a beginning of a breakdown in Muslim-Jewish relations, but others, and I'm more inclined to take this latter view, basically see this as an attempt by Muhammad to start forging a separate identity. If in fact, up until now, they had been doing what Jews were doing, facing Jerusalem as their direction of prayer, I think it makes sense that in wanting to establish a new religion, it was important to forge a new identity. And one of the most important ways of doing this was to change the direction of prayer. So I'm less inclined to see this as a sort of the beginning of a breakdown in Jewish relations, and that would come a little bit later on. So moving on, one of the other things that also happened is that during Ramadan, fasting during Ramadan was also instituted, because up until this point, it would appear that Muslims followed the practice of Jews, who, of course, fasted on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And the other thing that also happened was that the payment of zakat was introduced into the community. For those of you who have a knowledge of Hebrew, you will see um, a close equivalence between zakat and tzedakah, tzedakah, which means charity. Charity, not simply as a sort of a, if you want to give charity, you'll give it, but actually as a religious obligation. So both in Judaism and Islam, the giving of zakat or charity in the Jewish tradition are actually religiously ordained obligations. Indeed, fasting during Ramadan, payment of zakat, acknowledgement of Allah as the one and only God are amongst three of the five pillars of what make up Islam as a religion. The next point is, so when you start to look at this collection of developments in Islam, what you're actually starting to see is a shift from more theological concerns that were very, very much at the heart of Muhammad's time in Mecca. This is the time when he was developing a lot more of the theological foundations of Islam, and here the shift is much, much more to community-based concerns, payment of charity, religious rituals, direction of prayer, and so on and so on and so on. And in fact, interestingly, when you look at the Quran itself, you remember I gave you two charts last week that you could access online and play around with different ways of ordering the chapters or the surahs of the Quran. So if you actually move to the column that I showed you last week in a chart that talks about the place of revelation, you will actually start to see, interestingly, that the various revelations that took place in Medina were actually a lot more theologically grounded, and the more community-based concerns appear in the latter parts of not in the latter parts, but rather the revelations that occur in Medina itself. So that's an interesting transition that begins to occur. Now, although Muhammad believed that the Jewish tribes would welcome him, certainly according to Muslim history, the Jews were actually unhappy, and this is a point that I made a few minutes ago, with the idea of a prophet outside their own ethno-religious group. Remember, I said to you, as far as they were concerned, the last of the prophets came to an end with the end of the Old Testament period. But on the other hand, we do know that some prominent Jews did convert to Islam, including, very interestingly, the rabbi of one of the three dominant Jewish tribes in Medina, the Banu Qaynuqa. So this is the moment where we're going to see a very, very significant shift in the relationship between Muhammad and the Jews of Medina. Because what actually started to happen is that, in spite of the fact that the community in Medina had signed a pact of mutual self-protection and obligation to protect each other, we know that individual pagans, and in fact even recent converts to Islam in Medina, tried to thwart the pact with Muhammad. It may very well be that they were sort of concerned about the continuation of their own power within the community, but that certainly started to happen. And it's at about this time that we also start to witness a worsening in the relationship with various Jewish tribes who were very uneasy about the threatened demise of old tribal alliances in Medina. If you hark back to the point that I made last week, I pointed out that Arabia at the time was a heavily, heavily tribalized society. And it wasn't just the pagans in Arabia at the time, but it was also the Jews themselves. The Jews were actually themselves constituted into separate tribes, and those separate tribes were locked into a variety of alliances with various other tribes in Medina. So the Jews had a lot to gain by maintaining that particular power structures, and coming together as a single community was potentially going to threaten their own power and tribal alliances with the other tribes in Medina at the time. So what Reuben Firestone says about this is an article that he wrote in a journal in 1997. He makes this point. He says, according to the evidence from the Quran and the early traditions, in other words, from the Hadith, the Jews' rejection of Muhammad was not merely a polite refusal to accept the authority and the program of the Prophet, but rather a serious and an active resistance. In other words, what Firestone is making very clear here is that the Jews' attitude towards Muhammad and this new religion was not simply a matter of theology, but also was very politically motivated as well. And he goes on and says that given the delicate political balance in Medina amongst the various clans and their clients and their allies, Muhammad's potential and in fact eventual success in unifying the non-Jewish Medinans under the banner of a new religious community represented a serious threat to the status and even survival of the Jewish clans. And this, says Firestone, was not lost on the Jews. Their opposition to Muhammad was therefore much more serious than simply the rejection of a religious idea. In other words, what we have to understand very, very clearly is that Jews in Medina were very, very closely enmeshed in the tribal politics of the particular city. And therefore, a new arrangement was seen by them as potentially being very problematic. So as a result, Firestone goes on to say they actively opposed Muhammad's leadership by trying to undermine his status and authority in what was still a very fluid community. And the method of this opposition, according to the Quran and Islamic tradition, included, for example, the use of private defamation and even public satire. So, in other words, what we're starting to see here is the beginning of a breakdown in the relationship between Muhammad and the Jewish community. So we now come to the year of 624. And this is a very, very important moment because it's the very first battle that is fought between the Muslims and the Quraysh. Remember, the Quraysh were the most powerful tribe in Mecca, and they sought, of course, to thwart Muhammad and his followers' activities. And as a result, we see the first battle between the Quraysh and the Muslims. And even though they were heavily outnumbered, the Muslims actually won this particular battle. But it was also a moment which spelled the beginning of disaster for the Jewish tribes of Medina, because at about the time of this battle and the following one, another battle that was fought in 625, two of the tribes were actually expelled from Medina. There was firstly the Banu Kanuka that were expelled in 624, and then the Banu Nadir, who were expelled following the Battle of Uhud in 625. And the reason for that basically is that they had supposedly fallen short of their agreed upon commitments. You remember they signed the Constitution of Medina of self-protection, and for the subsequent consequent danger that they actually posed to the nascent Muslim community. And as a result of this, these two particular tribes were actually expelled from Medina at that particular time. Now, what then happens is 2 years later, is a further battle follows. It's called the Battle of the Trench. Very, very important moment in the history of the emergence of Islam in Arabia, because this represents actually the final unsuccessful push by the Meccans against Muhammad. So this is a very, very important moment. And as I write here, because this was such an important battle, the Meccans recruited allies from northwestern Arabia to join the fight, and they also got the assistance of the two exiled Jewish tribes. Remember, two of the tribes had already been exiled from Medina. They were outside of the power relationship of Muhammad and his followers, and therefore the Meccans, who were marching towards Medina, managed to get the assistance of these two exiled Jewish tribes. But they also sent envoys to the largest Jewish tribe that was still in Medina at the time, the Banu Qurayza, and they hoped to win their support. The reason being is that their crucial location on the south side of Medina would actually allow the Meccans to attack Muhammad from two sides if the Banu Qurayza became part of the Meccan group. Now, initially, the Banu Qurayza were hesitant to join the Meccan alliance, but when a substantial Meccan army arrived, they actually agreed to join them at that particular moment. And brings us then to the Banu Qurayza incident, because for their purported treachery, and we have to remember that at this particular battle, it was once again the Muhammad and his followers won that particular battle. And what then happened is that because of their purported treachery, Muhammad actually attacked the Banu Qurayza, the last remaining Jewish tribe in Medina at the time. We read in the Quran makes a very, very brief reference to this particular incident, where the Quran states that he caused those people of the book, a reference, of course, to the Jewish tribe in Medina, who helped them, that is the Quraysh, to come out of the forts. Some you killed and some you took prisoner. So this is a very, very significant moment in the relationship between Muhammad and the last remaining tribe. Now, what actually happens, what we have to do for further information about this, because the passage that I just showed you from the Quran is all that the Quran actually has to say about Muhammad's attack on the Banu Qurayza. And to get more information, we actually have to turn to the Hadith. We have to come back to Ibn Ishaq's biography of the Prophet. Remember, I told you he wrote a work called The Life of the Prophet. And in that particular work, we have an account of the execution of the Banu Qurayza. Now, what happens, according to the account, you can, if you want to get a full, detailed textual version of this, all you have to Google is Ibn Ishaq account of Banu Qurayza's execution in Medina, and you can actually get the full text of this from Ibn Ishaq's account. But basically, to sort of summarize what actually happened, is that when the Banu Qurayza realized that they were in serious trouble, the Quraysh had been defeated at the Battle of the Trench. They were surrounded by Muhammad and his forces. They basically offered to give themselves up, and Muhammad was not prepared to do that. They then made a further claim and said, "We'll give you everything. Just let us leave basically here with our families. We don't want anything else." Again, Muhammad basically refused their plea at this particular point. And what happens at this point in the story is one of the tribal allies of the Banu Qurayza, a very powerful tribe known as the Aus, AWS. They were one of the tribes with which the Banu Qurayza had been very closely aligned in a previous occasion. The Aus, this very powerful tribe, also approached Muhammad to try and allow the Banu Qurayza a plea of leniency. Muhammad once again refused, but not only did he refuse, but he actually turned to the leader of the Aus, this large tribe with whom the Quraysh had been aligned, and he basically said, "You have to actually deliver judgment in this particular case." Now, you can well imagine that the leader of the Aus was between a rock and a hard place. He would have known that to actually deliver a judgment that would have been favorable towards the Banu Qurayza would not have been to their benefit. So as a result, they delivered a verdict of the Banu, a verdict of death, in fact, not merely expulsion, to the against the Banu Qurayza. And what then happened is once that particular, notice, of course, that Muhammad clearly wanted to distance himself from issuing this particular verdict. But once the verdict was actually issued, Muhammad gathered some 600 to 900 members of the male members of the Banu Qurayza, and they were executed. In fact, according to the way the story is told by Ibn Itzchak, a trench was dug, and the 6 to 900 male members of the Banu Qurayza were beheaded. And as for the women and the children, they were basically treated as the property of the Ummah in Medina at the time. In fact, Muhammad took one of the women of that particular of the Banu Qurayza as a wife, and others were actually enslaved, and so on and so on. So that, in brief, is the way that the story is actually told by Ibn Itzchak. You can well imagine that this is would certainly be seen in the historical evolution of the relationship between the Jews and Muhammad as the low point. There's no question of that. But what is interesting is to see how this particular incident is actually dealt with in secondary sources. See, Ibn Itzchak is the primary source upon which we base our knowledge of the execution of the Banu Qurayza. It really is the primary source and really the only one that we really have to rely on. So it's interesting how secondary sources, scholars of Islam, have dealt with this particular incident. So, for example, one particular scholar, I've given you, by the way, the URL here because I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but if you want to explore this in a lot more detail, it takes time, but I have given you the references for you to read further. But one scholar, one Islamic scholar, W.N. Arafat, not to be confused with Yasser Arafat, please, and certainly not a relative, but a scholar by the name of W.N. Arafat, basically dismisses the historical veracity of this particular incident, and he sort of claims that in fact it was a sort of a literary construction. In other words, it was not a real historical event, but rather he sort of argues that Ibn Itzchak constructed a sort of a literary narrative, if you want, regarding this particular incident. And he offers all sorts of evidence to support this particular claim. I have some doubts about the strength of his argument, because at the end of the day, what he sort of argues also is that the reason why this is an incident that simply could not have occurred is because it does not conform with the whole idea of Islam as a religion of peace, and so on and so on and so on. In other words, when you read Arafat's argument, it sounds a lot more like an apology for Islam as a religion rather than an actual sort of, I think, solid historical argument. But nevertheless, he argues that it's essentially a literary construction of what might have happened rather than a real historical account. But then we come to a scholar by the name of Kista. Kista was a scholar at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a very prominent scholar of Islam and the relationship between Islam and the Jews. And what he does in this particular document that I've given you again, the online reference to, is he very forensically is a good word, forensically pulls apart almost point by point each of the arguments that is made by Arafat. So he sort of argues that Arafat's reading of Ibn Itzchak is completely wrong. And he actually makes the case that Ibn Itzchak did present an actual incident that actually occurred at that particular time. And again, as I said, I'm not going to go into the detail, but you can read more of this if you want in your own particular time. I'll just quote from one little piece of his article. He said, "Odd assumptions appear in Arafat's article on this particular subject, that is the question of the execution of the Banu Qurayza." He says, Arafat tries to prove the unreliability of the account of the events of the massacre of the Qurayza as recorded by Ibn Itzchak and transmitted by later Muslim scholars and so on. So these odd assumptions are the ones that he tends to take apart in his particular article. And then we come to the views of Reuben Firestone and also a scholar by the name of Norman Stillman. Now, both Firestone and Stillman are important Jewish scholars and Jewish scholars of the relationship between Islam and the Jews. And I've given you references to their particular books if you want to follow through on this. But both Reuben Firestone and Stillman take an actually interesting point of view and call it out for what it was. In fact, they argue that we have to be very clear and understand that the three tribes in Medina had actually signed a pact of mutual self-protection and looking after the common good. And their argument basically is that the Jewish tribes of Medina, particularly the Qurayza, in the last battle, the Battle of the Trench, when they joined the Meccans in their fight against Medina, basically were not faithful to their obligations. They had basically were traitors in a certain sense to the pact that they had actually signed. So Reuben Firestone, for example, makes this particular point. He goes on and says Western non-Muslim thinkers have criticized this particular act, that is the execution, as barbaric and unbecoming of a principled and respectable religious leader, let alone a man representing God's will through his role as a prophet. Muslim critics have considered it at the same time, however, a just end determined by the rules of arbitration that were acceptable to both parties. And Firestone goes on to say, as a Jewish scholar, not as an apologist for Islam, mind you, he said it was not considered unreasonable, taking into account the deceit and the treason of the Jews, for acting as a fifth column on behalf of Medina's enemies, despite having signed on the Medina Pact as trustworthy allies. And he goes on to says the reader will make his or her own judgment, but this is the book that he wrote, by the way, for Jews, an introduction to Islam for Jews. And he sort of says Jews should keep in mind that biblical patriarchs and kings also engaged in massacres of the enemies of Israel in similar numbers. However one decides, he says, it must be kept in mind that in both cases, we are observing the behaviors of peoples living in a society with very different norms and expectations than our own. In other words, what we might describe as being a very rough and barbaric form of justice was basically the way matters were settled at that particular time. Blood feuds, vendettas, and so on and so on and so on. And finally, we come to a scholar by the name of Andrew Boston. Now, Boston is a particularly interesting scholar. I'm not sure if scholar might be the wrong word to use. Andrew Boston is an interesting character. He's actually a professor of medicine at Brown University. I'm not sure if he's still there, but I know for many, many years he was a medical academic at Brown University, of course, in the United States. And he makes the following observation. In writing about all of the views that I have put forward up to this particular point, he basically dismisses them all. And he says it is critical that Muslims and non-Muslims alike consider seriously the implications of accepting these apologetic analyses of this particular massacre. So he basically takes the view, takes a very harsh view of this, and in fact goes much further in condemning Islam as a religion that is sort of that built into the DNA, if you want, of Islam, is a sort of a hatred of people outside of the Islamic community. My interest in Boston was actually piqued when I first started teaching probably about 20 years ago about Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Jewish relations during the Middle Ages at my university. And at that particular time, when I gave a community lecture, when I was asked as an adult education course to deliver a lecture, someone in the audience, when I presented my particular views about this, put their hand up and said, "Well, have you ever read the work by Andrew Boston? Because if you have, you probably would take a very, very different view of this whole question." Now, I hadn't read Boston at the time, so the very next day I got to the university, got the library to order his two books, and these are two books that he wrote. One is called The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism. The other one is called The Legacy of Jihad. Now, what piqued my interest was this. Both of the books are quite amazing. They're very, very thick volumes. Both of them contain an incredible collection of primary sources, classical Arabic primary sources that had been translated from classical Arabic into English. In fact, most of these sources were made available for the very first time to an English-speaking audience. But what was even more interesting is that the text in classical Arabic had been translated by Boston himself, a medical academic. And so I was very interested. It turns out that he'd actually taught himself classical Arabic and then proceeded to translate these texts and write commentaries that were not particularly positive towards his reading of Islam as a religious tradition. So I decided to probe a little bit further. And when I Googled him, I found a very lengthy interview that had taken place between the interviewer and him regarding the question of these two books that he had written. And the interviewer asked him the question, Dr. Boston, can you explain why it is that you, a medical academic, decided to go down the track of devoting a good part of your life to translating these previously inaccessible texts and producing these two volumes? And interestingly, Boston answered. He said it started with 9/11. He said, "I remember I was in New York at the time. I was heading home, and boom, the Twin Towers were hit at the time." And he then said that as I was heading home, he's passed by a bookstore and bought a book on an introduction to Islam, and that was the beginning of a long journey. And in the interview, he starts talking about a number of scholars that he read, particularly a scholar by the name of Bat-Yaor. That is a pseudonym. Bat-Yaor actually means the daughter of the Nile. I'm going to talk about her a little bit later. And he said that was the beginning of my relationship to and my interest in the whole relationship between Islam and the Jews, and in fact the non-Muslim world. So my problem with Boston is this: there is no question that we owe him a debt for having brought to our attention many, many classical texts of the Islamic tradition that previously were inaccessible to a non-English speaking audience. The problem that I have with him is the way he's doing history, because he's starting from the present and conflating that with the past. In other words, he's very clearly formed a view about Islam, but it's a view that begins with Islamism. Because you remember at the very, very, very beginning, I made a point of distinguishing between Islam as a religion and the politicization of that religion, which we really would have to refer to as Islamism and so on. And I think what he's doing here is his starting point is Islamism and working back and conflating that historically with Islam as a religion. In fact, just to make sure that I actually was reading Boston correctly, I sent an email to two leading scholars of this subject. One of them was Bernard Lewis, who recently passed away, but he was a scholar at Princeton University for many, many decades, probably regarded as the leading scholar of Islam and the Jews. And when I wrote to him, he got back to me and said, the works that you cite by Boston and others as well of the same school render an important service in collecting and making available valuable documentary material. This is, in other words, what I'd said earlier. But it seems to me that they err to the point of being misleading in choosing material that points in one direction only. The situation in a large and complex society over a period of more than 14 centuries cannot be governed in a few simple generalizations. Another scholar that I also wrote to was Mark Cohen, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later. If not today, then certainly next week, but I think I'll get there today. And he said to me the following. He says, as for doctor, and in brackets he put medical doctor, I agree with your suspicions about him. Along with Batya Or, he belongs to a school of Islamophobic writers who have no concept of the canons of historical scholarship. I may understand their motives, and theirs, for instance, was force. We don't have to go that. And he basically goes on and says that their real problem is that they take a lot of the works that they cite out of actual context. So that's essentially gives you a sort of an idea. Going back to the execution of the Banu Qurayza, I wanted to give you a flavor of how contested an issue this is amongst contemporary scholars. When we go to the secondary literature, it is by no means a straightforward issue. But the important point that I would emphasize here is that when we read scholars and the way they treat historical incidents, we have to be very, very much aware of the approach that they take to the reading of history. And I have a serious problem with sort of working backwards rather than working forwards. Historians work forwards. They don't conflate the present with the past. And I think that's a problem with some of the more contentious scholars of this particular subject. So I'm going to stop here for a few minutes, Jackie, and see if people have any questions that they want answered.
Wonderful. We do have some questions. Anita, you have your hand up. Is it okay, or is that about the chat? I'm hoping. Okay. Just chat to me if you need anything, Anita. I do have a couple questions here. So my first question is, do these Jewish tribes of Banu Qurayza and Banu Nadir have any relation to the 12 tribes of Israel?
No, no. So when we say Banu, we're often led to think B'nai Yisrael. Absolutely none at all. In other words, these are simply Jews living in Medina at the time, and because Medina was a very heavily tribalized society, they also organized themselves into tribal clans. So no relationship at all.
Okay, thank you. The other question I have up is, as a Catholic, I appreciated hearing that the angel Gabriel approached Muhammad. What about Gabriel makes him a figure in the three monotheistic faiths?
Can you repeat that again, Jackie?
As a Catholic, I appreciated hearing that the angel Gabriel approached Muhammad. What about Gabriel makes him a figure in the three monotheistic faiths?
Well, it's when if we go back in Jewish tradition, we have to understand that what I would refer to as angelology, sort of the whole issue of angels within the Jewish tradition. We have to understand that there's quite a difference between the way angels are referred to in the Bible, basically as messengers of God. And in Jewish tradition, certainly, a lot of the biblical figures of angels start to take on new sort of meaning in post-biblical religion. And it's not just the angel Gabriel. There are many, many other angels that play an important role. But certainly when Islam came onto the scene, because Gabriel was such an important figure both in Islam, both in Judaism and Christianity, it was one of the many, many features of Jewish and Christian belief that Islam took on board as well.
Wonderful. And the last one I have, were there tensions within the Jewish community itself with everything that was going on?
Well, certainly what one would imagine that if the Jewish community itself in Medina had organized itself into different tribal groups, and these different tribal groups had different alliances with other tribes in Medina, at least on a political level, one would imagine that there were certain differences, if you want. I'm not so sure that one would go so far as to sort of describe them as tensions, but each one of them had a particular power base. And I think that would go a long way in explaining why, when an Ummah started to coalesce in Medina under the leadership of Muhammad, each one of them was very intent on protecting their particular power base in the community. But certainly they were differentiated from each other politically.
Thank you. I think we can continue, Paul.
Okay, well, thank you, Jackie. So we're getting to a point in the story. You remember we came to the last point in 627 when the Battle of the Trench occurred. This was the final battle in which the people of Medina, the community of Medina, triumphed against the Quraysh and their allies from Mecca. And in 628, a treaty was signed between the Medina and the Quraysh. 1 year later, there were skirmishes that still continued between allied tribes, including the Quraysh, and that was interpreted in Medina by Muhammad and his followers as a breaking of the treaty. And as a result, in the following year, in the year of 630, Muhammad marched on Mecca with 10,000 men, and what then followed was a bloodless victory as the Quraysh, the most powerful tribe up until that point, actually capitulated. And what we end up seeing is that when Muhammad came into Mecca, one of the very, very first things that he did is he cleansed the Kaaba of the idols. Remember, I pointed out to you that in Islamic tradition, the Kaaba was the first monotheistic house of prayer that had been built by Abraham, Ishmael, and Hagar. Remember in the biblical story, Abraham, according to the biblical story, at the behest of Sarah, expels Hagar and her son Ishmael. And in the biblical story, they basically end up in Egypt. But the Quranic version of that story basically has them continuing on to Mecca, where they build the Kaaba, first house of monotheistic worship, which subsequently becomes a pagan house of worship. But then when Muhammad enters the city of Mecca in 630, according to the historical narrative, he cleanses the Kaaba of all its idols, in other words, rededicating it as a house of monotheism, but interestingly, did not remove the statues of Mary and Jesus. And we'll talk about the special relationship of Islam, both to Jews and to Christians, shortly. So that's what then happens. And then in 632, we see the death of Muhammad. And what then happens is that with his death, we actually have the survival of the Ummah coming under threat. Now, I'm not talking about the threat of military invasion. By this particular time, the Meccans have been defeated. The point that I'm simply making is that you have to understand that when Muhammad died, we're not yet talking about an established religion. We're not talking about a religion like today, where Islam has a very firm foundation. Basically, at the time that Muhammad died, we have a community that was still very vulnerable and in danger of the tribes going back to their old tribal alliances. And this was very, very much without a leader, this could have very, very well happened. And in fact, what actually happened, remember I mentioned to you that Muhammad had a nephew by the name of Ali. Not only was Ali his nephew, but also Muhammad's son-in-law. He had married one of Muhammad's daughters, a woman by the name of Fatima. So in a certain sense, we have to understand that Muhammad did not died, but he had no male relatives. He had no sons. So the closest relative that he had was Ali. But the problem was that Ali was very, very taken up with funeral preparations for his father-in-law and for his uncle. And he was therefore not able to concentrate on the business of succession. So what actually happened is that Abu Bakr, who was a faithful companion of Muhammad and also Muhammad's father-in-law, he was the father of a woman called Aisha, and he was his father-in-law. So while these funeral preparations were taking place, and there was a danger that the whole of the alliance, the whole of the Ummah would fall apart, Abu Bakr gathered together the elite of the Muslim community and basically convinced them to retain the framework of the Ummah, and they appointed him the first caliph. Now, when we talk about a caliph, we are talking about a successor to the Prophet. The word caliph, some people pronounce it caliph, is a word that simply means a successor to the Prophet. And he was appointed the first caliph at that particular time. And within 2 years of his being appointed as caliph, we basically see the consolidation of Islam in the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. Remember that basically it had begun in Medina. Muhammad was born in Mecca. In 622, he had fled. You can see here on the map where I'm pointing to, he'd fled to Medina. It was established as a religion, and then established in Mecca. And then finally, within 2 years of Abu Bakr becoming the first successor to the Prophet, it was established as a religion throughout the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. Which brings us then to the next stage of the story, where I'm going to start talking about the spread of Islam. So as I mentioned, 632 to 634, Islam becomes the dominant religion of the Arabian Peninsula. And what then happens in the next part of the story is we are taken to what I refer to as the four rightly guided caliphs, the four rightly guided caliphs. These were, remember, caliph means a successor. So when we talk about the successors to Muhammad, remember I mentioned before he died without a successor in 632. Abu Bakr was appointed the first caliph. He ruled from 632 to 634. He was then followed by Umar ibn al-Khattab. Then came Uthman ibn Affan. Importantly, Uthman ibn Affan was a member of a very, very powerful family known as the Umayyads. Now, the reason for singling out this family will become evident in a few minutes, but I make a particular point of him being related to the Umayyad family. And in 656, when Uthman died, finally, Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and the son-in-law of Muhammad, became the last rightly guided caliph, right? So as a collection, these four successors to Muhammad are regarded as the rightly guided caliphs. The Arabic word, the Muslim word, is Rashidun. This is referred to as the Rashidun Caliphate. They were not related to each other. This was not dynastic. Rather, the elite of the Muslim community, when one caliph died, the elite of the Muslim community decided who would be the next successor. But it's important to understand that lurking in the background behind the appointment of these first three successors was always the question of the legitimacy of Ali's right to the succession, because he really was, if you think about it, the closest male member in relationship to Muhammad. But you remember, as I said, he'd been very busy with funeral arrangements and so on, and he was therefore not able to stake a claim as the rightful successor to the Prophet. And it was not until 656 that he actually did become the caliph. But then 5 years later, he was assassinated in 661 by a Muslim sect known as the Kharijites. The Kharijites were, I won't go into the reasons for this, it's a little bit complex, but they were dissatisfied with certain aspects of Ali's rule, and he was then assassinated in the year of 661. So this is the stage of the story where Muhammad successors the four rightly guided caliphs. Now what happens, and this is an important moment in the history of Islam, From that moment on, from the time that Ali was assassinated, the Muslim community actually split over the rightful line of succession. And this is where we have the beginnings of the split between Sunni and Shia, right? The Sunnis and the Shiites. When we talk about the Sunnis actually regarded Ali as the last of the rightly guided caliphs. And their view basically was that from this moment on, it would be the Ummah or the elite of the Ummah, the elite of the Muslim community, that would decide who the caliph would actually be. Whereas the Shiites did not think of Ali as the last, but they thought of him as the first imam, the first religious leader of the community, and they thought of his successors as the rightful authorities of Islam. So at its core, the most fundamental difference between Sunnis and Shiites is the question of who is the rightful successor to the Prophet. Now, today in the Islamic world, the Sunnis constitute the majority. I think something like 85% of the Muslim world is Sunni, and only about 15% are Shia. Iran is Shia, as is Iraq as well. But most of the Muslim world does not think of Ali as being the first Imam and his successors as being the rightful authorities of Islam. So that's essentially the main point of difference between these two particular groupings within Islam, the question of the rightful line of succession. In any event, let's just have a look at the map, because what happens under these rightful guided caliphs is quite amazing if you think about it. You remember when Abu Bakr died in 634, in fact, Islam had basically taken root in the Arabian Peninsula. And from 632 to 661, in a space of almost 30 years, just under 30 years, Islam had actually spread eastwards into Mesopotamia, Palestine, Persia, and also westwards into Egypt and North Africa. And let's remember into Egypt, not North Africa. Let's remember that this area, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Egypt, were under Byzantine Christian control. So this is a moment in Christian history when the Orthodox Church, based in Constantinople, lost control of its holdings in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia, Palestine, and so on. Which brings us then to the next stage of the story. Because in 661, you remember Ali was assassinated in 661. What actually then happened is that the caliphate became dynastic. Because what happened in 661 is that we actually have the establishment of the first dynastic caliphate under Muawiyah I. Remember, I pointed out to you before that one of the four rightly guided caliphs was actually closely related to the Umayyad family. And with the death of Ali, there was a sort of a power vacuum, if you want, and this very powerful Umayyad family stepped into the breach and took control of the caliphate, which actually became a dynastic caliphate. Now, what's important here is that the capital of the caliphate was then established in Damascus. Damascus actually became the center of the Islamic world at the time. And it's also during this period of Umayyad rule that the Umayyads actually managed to move across into Spain as well, right? So you get the further spread of Islam in this particular period. And finally, in 750, the Umayyads were then deposed by Abu al-Abbas as-Safa, which will take us into the next stage of the story. Importantly, what we should also keep in mind is that it is during the period of the Umayyad Caliphate, when power was centered in Damascus, that the very, very famous Al-Aqsa Mosque was actually built in the city of Jerusalem. So the origins of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on what Jews refer to as the Temple Mount, were actually built during the period of the Umayyad Caliphate. The map gives you an idea of what actually happened to the spread of Islam in this final stage of the spread, if you want, of the story. Remember last time when we looked under the four rightly guided caliphs, Islam had spread to the east and to the west as far as Egypt. And in the final stage under Umayyad rule, it spread into North Africa, an important part of the story because North Africa at the time was constituted indigenously by a group known as Berbers. The Berbers were the indigenous population of North Africa, not Arabs. Arabs were not indigenous to North Africa, but they basically converted to Islam under Umayyad rule, and then the Umayyads got as far as Spain in the year of 711. If you think about it, quite an amazing sort of story. From 632, with Islam being consolidated in Arabia, to about 711. In other words, in the space of about 80 years, Islam had basically spread across to the east and to the west, quite a remarkable sort of achievement. So that's essentially the story of the two caliphates. Which brings us to the next part of the story. In other words, when what happened in 750 is that the Umayyads had been basically deposed by the Abbasid Caliphate. They did it in a fairly efficient sort of way. They managed to assassinate most of the members of the Umayyad family. In fact, there was only one important survivor of that assassination, a man by the name of Prince Abd Rahman I, and he managed to escape to Spain. And you remember I mentioned a few minutes ago that the Umayyads had actually established themselves in Spain in 711, but when the Abbasids took control of the caliphate, they were not able to get as far as Spain. So Spain was the only part of the Muslim world that remained under Umayyad control. And when the last surviving member of the Umayyad family fled across into Spain, he established Umayyad rule in Spain. Firstly, an Umayyad emirate, and what would eventually become the caliphate of the Umayyads in Spain. But basically, the Abbasid Caliphate became the most powerful group now in the Islamic world. And importantly, the seat of the caliphate moved from Damascus to Baghdad. So Baghdad becomes the next important part of the story. And what's important here to note is that this marks the beginning of an intellectual and cultural golden age in Islam. I think many of you might have heard about the great achievements in fields of poetry, of philosophy, mathematics, literature, whatever, many fields of cultural achievement. A lot of these took place during the period of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad at that particular time. But what we also start to see is that from about the 10th century on, even though this caliphate, you can see from the dates at the top of the screen, even though this caliphate lasted for a period of about 500 years, by about the 10th century, we start to see the fragmentation of Muslim unity. In other words, from about the 8th to the 10th century, for a period of about 200 years, the Islamic world is unified under the rule of a single caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. But for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to explore, we start to see in the 10th century the fragmentation of Muslim unity with rival caliphates being established in other parts of the Muslim world. So, for example, in Egypt, you get a group known as the Fatimids who establish a caliphate in Egypt. And I told you before about Prince Abd Rahman I, who had escaped across to Spain as the last surviving member of the Umayyad family. And eventually in Cordoba, a caliphate was established in there as well. So from that moment on, from about the 10th century, you cannot really talk about a single point of unity within the Islamic world. This is only the beginning, because from this point on, you're going to see further and further fragmentation within the Islamic world. In fact, it's not going to be really until the emergence of the powerful Ottoman Empire that you're going to see once again most of the Islamic world being unified under a single political rule. So let's now turn to the question of Jews under Muslim rule. And the first question we might ask is, what was the attitude of the Jews to the Muslim conquerors? Because you remember, if you look at this map from Arabia, pretty well, Islam has spread right across the East. And we have to remember that there was a large Jewish community. It wasn't then called Persia. It was actually by then called Sassania, but it was the old Persian Empire. There were certainly Jews in Palestine and in other parts of Mesopotamia, Jews in Egypt and North Africa, and certainly in Spain. So a legitimate question, a very important question to ask, is how did they feel about these Muslim conquerors? Well, generally they were welcoming. And some people might be surprised by this, but the question, of course, is why? Well, first thing we have to understand is that for many, many centuries, Jews, particularly in Mesopotamia, in Palestine, Egypt, in North Africa, and also in Spain for that matter, had been under one form or another of Christian rule. And they had suffered a great deal of persecution, great deal of, we mightn't call it anti-Semitism, but certainly anti-Jewish persecution and discrimination. And they therefore looked upon, and as did, by the way, there were brief periods of persecution in the Persian Empire, and there was a great deal of political and economic instability in the late Sasanian period in the eastern part of the Muslim world. And so therefore the Jews basically looked upon these Muslim invaders as liberators. They welcomed them, in fact, with open arms. They thought this was going to be a welcome break from the persecution they'd been experiencing. And in fact, what's interesting is that we see a wave of messianic expectation amongst many Jews who saw the Arab invasion, in fact, as a visitation from God upon, to quote from Jewish writings of the time, the wicked kingdom of Edom. Now, in medieval Jewish writing, Christianity is often referred to as the kingdom of Edom. Edom was the nation that emerged from the twin brother of Jacob, who was called Esau. Esau is in biblical history regarded as the father of the Edomites. And in rabbinic thinking, the Edomites eventually were identified with Rome. And then, of course, when Rome became Christianized, then Edom became associated with Christianity in rabbinic thinking. Because if you think about it, Jacob and Esau were twin brothers. We know, of course, that there was a certain antagonism that emerged between these two twin brothers. And in a similar way, when the rabbinic tradition thought of the relationship between Judaism and its daughter religion, Islam, it looked back to Jacob and Esau as archetypes. So Jacob becomes the father of Israel, the father of the Jewish people, and Esau becomes the father of Edom. Edom becomes Rome, Rome becomes Christianity, and that's why in medieval Jewish writing, Christianity is identified with Edom. But in any event, they saw the Arab invasion as a visitation from God upon the wicked kingdom of Edom, the Christians, under whose rule they had been suffering up until that particular point. And in fact, the point that I make here on the screen is that we have instances of Jews openly collaborating with Muslim invaders, especially against the Byzantine Christians at that particular point. Now, the question that we also have to ask is not only how did Jews feel about the Muslims, but in fact, what was the status of non-Muslim populations under Islamic rule? Because as Islam began to spread to the east and to the west, you have to appreciate, of course, that it came into contact with a variety of different populations. There were, on the one hand, many pagans still. There were, of course, Jews. There were Christians. So what was the attitude of Islam towards these non-Muslim populations? Well, if you were a pagan, you had very few options. The option was basically conversion to Islam or death. Though on a good day, the caliph might commute death to lifetime slavery. I suspect death might have nevertheless been a better option, but nevertheless, that was the situation for pagans. Now, why was that? Because pagans were regarded as a people who were not enlightened by the truth of belief in one God. And commonly, Jews, Christians, and Muslims saw themselves as having a mission of spreading the light, the enlightenment of belief in monotheism to these pagan people. We know that Christians were committed to the spread of monotheism. Muslims were committed to that. And interestingly, even though Judaism today is not really a proselytizing religion, at this particular time, Jews actively were engaged in proselytizing amongst pagans as well. So because pagans were regarded as having no religion, in this particular phase of the story, this was the option that was given to them. However, when it came to Jews and Christians, they had a very special status. They were known as al-Kitab. In other words, they were known as people of the book. In other words, a people who had been in receipt of a revealed scripture. In the case of the Jews, of course, it was the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, and of course the rest of the Bible. And of course, in the case of the Christian world, it was the Christian Bible, both the Old and the New Testament. So they were a people who did have possess revelation and possess a religion. And therefore, because of that, they qualified for a measure of toleration and protection under the rule of the Muslim state. But because they had not embraced Islam as the superior religion, if you want, they were regarded also as subordinates at the same time. They were not placed on an equal standing with Muslims, but nevertheless, because they were people of the book, they were protected and tolerated in that way. And in fact, the basis of this relationship is set out in a passage in the Quran. This surah says, "Fight against such of those who have been given scripture, but do not believe in Allah or the last day, and do not forbid that which Allah has forbidden by his messenger." So it's clearly referring to Jews and Christians. In other words, fight against those who have been given scripture, but don't believe in Allah or the last day. That is Jews and Christians, and fight until they pay the tribute readily and until they are brought low. So you have to fight them until they pay the tribute readily and they are brought low. The question then becomes, of course, how was this particular injunction in the Quran carried out in practice? Well, what actually happened is that Jews and Christians were invited, but not compelled to embrace Islam. And the reason for that is because there is an interesting surah at the very beginning of the Quran, which makes the point that there is no compulsion in religion. The right course has become clear from the wrong. He who rejects false deities and believes in Allah has grasped a firm handlehold which will never break. So, in other words, Jews and Christians who have rejected paganism already have a religion, and therefore there is no compulsion in religion, but nevertheless they were invited and probably even expected to embrace the superior religion of Islam. But if they refused, they could continue with their old beliefs because they were the people of the book, but they were subjected to various restrictions. And this was actually given practical effect through a legal instrument, if you want, a pact or a contract known as a dhimma. A dhimma is a word in Arabic which simply means a contract, a pact. And those people who came under the jurisdiction of the dhimma were referred to as dhimmi, right? I think somebody has their microphone on. We're getting some feedback coming through. Thank you. And those who came under the jurisdiction of the dhimma were called dhimmi. So Jews and Christians living under Muslim rule were dhimmi. So when we think about dhimmi, we are talking about a people who are, on the one hand, protected and tolerated, but on the other hand, treated as a second-class group because they have not embraced the superior religion of Islam. And outward signs of this subordination, if you want, dimitude, included the payment of a special tax. So in addition to the regular taxes that people had to pay within the Muslim world, Jews and Christians had to pay this additional tax called the jizya. And there were various other discriminatory provisions that were gradually brought together in what was known as the Pact of Umar. The Pact of Umar was just one version of a dhimma. It's probably the best known version, and I have attached in the notes as an appendix the actual text of the Pact of Umar. I'm not going to go through it here because we don't have time, but for example, Jews and Christians were not allowed to mount horses or have armor. There were certain restrictions on the way they actually built their houses of worship. There could be no public displays of Judaism and Christianity. In other words, it was fine for them to worship inside their synagogues and churches, but public displays of their religion in the streets were not permitted. So, for example, for Christians, Palm Sunday would have been a problem. Processions on saints' days would have been a problem. So on and so on and so on. If you read the document, you'll see that there are many, many sort of provisions, including, by the way, distinctive dress. There were certain items of dress that both Jews and Christians had to wear to distinguish them from the members of the Islamic community. And what is very, very important to understand, the impact of the dhimmi status on the Jews was contextually dependent. Even though they came under the jurisdiction of this contractual relationship, we have to understand that the question of how strictly this particular relationship was enforced was a function of time and place. Not everywhere and not at all times was the dhimma applied in the strictest possible form. So, for example, there was a period of about 200 to 300 years in Muslim Spain, what is often referred to as the golden age of Spanish Jewry, where the provisions of the discriminatory provisions of the dhimma were almost overlooked. But on the other hand, there were times when they were very, very strictly enforced, and there was in fact a period when Jews, for example, suffered a great deal under a group known as the Almohads, and we're going to talk about that next week. But nevertheless, this is the position that we'll finish off in today, where we're actually talking about Jews and Christians enjoying a favored status under Muslim rule, but nevertheless a second-class status. Now, the question of how Jews actually fared in practice under the rule of Islam is a topic that we will take up next week. So I think we've got about 5+ minutes or so. So I'm going to hand over back to you, Jackie, to see if people have any final questions to ask.
Sure thing, Paul. Thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions that came in. The first one I have is, do Muslims believe Abraham abandoned Sarah and Isaac and spent the rest of his life with Hagar and Ishmael? Does it then mean they do not believe Abraham is buried in the tombs of the patriarchs in Israel?
Yeah, so in other words, what's very important to understand is that the way the Quran sort of, if you want, retells the biblical story of Abraham in the Hebrew scriptures is that Sarah and Isaac take secondary place. And it is basically Hagar and Ishmael who take primary place. Remember that Ishmael is the firstborn son of Abraham. And therefore, his status as the one as being in the line of the covenant, if you want, with God, takes primary place. So in a certain sense, Sarah and Isaac are not so much displaced, but because Ishmael is the first in the line of Abraham's descendants, the primary narrative runs through them. And yes, they certainly believe that the cave of Machpelah which is in Hebron, is the place where Abraham and his wife Sarah, and it became a family mausoleum. Yes, Muslims believe that to be the burial site as well.
Thank you. The second question I have was, were the Umayyads Shia or Sunni?
So as I mentioned, again, they were Sunni, right? The Umayyads were a Sunni group. And in fact, for most of the history that we are talking about, we are essentially talking about a history that is dominated by the Sunni division of Islam, right? In fact, when it comes to the Jewish story, very, very little of that story occurs under Shiite rule. But where Jews did come under Shiite rule, it was the case that they suffered more under Shiite rule than they did under Sunni rule. But we're going to take up that topic next week. We're actually going to begin with the question of, once we have the spread of Islam, and once we have Jews and Christians coming under the jurisdiction of the Dhimma, in other words, taking on the legal status of dhimmi, what did that actually mean in practice for the Jews living under Muslim rule? And we're going to explore that in a little bit more detail when we start the session next week.
Okay, do we have one more question? What was the attraction of Islam that convinced all these people to accept it? I guess going back, or was it just that they were conquered?
Okay, so great question. So firstly, I think we have to, taking the last point, were they conquered? I think we have to move away from a very common stereotype that Islam was spread by the sword. Now, there is an element of truth in that. In other words, we are talking about Islamic conquests in the same way that when we talk about the Crusades were not exactly some sort of peaceful mission on the part of Christianity. So to a certain degree, it is a story of conquest. To a certain degree, it is conquest by the sword. But what we have to understand is that for pagans, and at this particular time, there were still many, many pagans in the old Persian, or what was by now the Sasanian Empire. There were still many pagans living in the Middle East and in North Africa and so on. But you have to understand that pagans had a very sort of fatalistic view of life. Pagans always believed that they were quite literally at the mercy of the gods. And in pagan religion, in pagan belief, the gods, in a certain sense, were sort of very unpredictable. You have many, many stories. For example, the Babylonian story of the flood. The gods simply decided one morning to flood the whole of the earth because human beings on earth are sort of raging and partying all night and don't let the gods get a good night's sleep. And in the Babylonian version of the flood story, on a whim, the gods decide to destroy the world. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, that pagans actually sacrificed to the gods, because they believed that by sacrificing, they were actually physically sustaining them. And the idea was, it's the old adage of, the quickest way to a man's brain or man's heart is through his stomach. And they believed that by keeping the gods happy through great sacrifices, the gods would not destroy them. So pagans were constantly living on the edge. They never knew what would happen the next day, quite literally. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all being monotheistic religions, offered a very, very important thing that pagan religion did not. It's the hope of redemption and salvation. The whole idea that there was an afterlife, the whole idea that good deeds would be rewarded ultimately, if not in this life, then in an afterlife, was a very, very powerful sort of idea that pagans sort of bought into. And that is why when Judaism was a proselytizing religion, it was popular amongst pagans. And certainly once Christianity and Islam came onto the scene, it was absorbed as well. Now, as for Christians, the reason why many, many Christians did succumb to Islam is because you've got to remember that they had been the dominant power group in the Middle East before the advent of Islam. So individual Christians had a great deal to lose, wealth, position in society. Because one of the things, for example, that you lost as a dhimmi, at least in theory, was access to public office. Jews and Christians were not able to occupy public office. So for Christians to actually lose economic and political power was going to be very, very damaging. And that's why we find that far greater numbers of Christians converted to Islam than was the case with Jews. And the reason why far fewer Jews succumbed to Islam is because Jews for hundreds and hundreds of years had been a people without political power. In fact, the last time that Jews enjoyed any real political power was in the year of 70, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And from that point on, Jews came under the successive rule of one foreign power under another. So in a certain sense, when Islam came onto the scene, Jews had little to lose, and therefore they did not see Islam as a sort of an option that was particularly favorable towards them. So in other words, pagans had good reason to convert. For Christians, it was a very pragmatic decision. And for Jews, there was little reason for them to succumb to this new faith.
Wow. Thank you, Paul. This is wonderful. I'd like to thank you for your insightful presentation today and for setting the stage for the important series on the shared histories of Jews and Islam. Your expertise and thoughtful approach have given us a deeper understanding of these complexities and connections between these two communities. We will continue to explore the rich tapestry of Jewish and Islamic histories, diving deeper into their intertwined legacies and the lessons they offer for today. For today's world, next Tuesday, September 24th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Our well-known and familiar face, Ellen Resnick, will return to host the final session of the series. We're grateful that you joined us today, and we hope our discussion has sparked your interest and curiosity. For those that will be celebrating the upcoming Jewish holidays, we wish you a peaceful New Year with family and friends. Stay safe and take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.